I'm a post-war British political historian and I know nothing about sustainability. But what I am interested in is how you get transformations of the economic policy framework, and particularly in moments of crisis. Now, Rahm Emanuel famously said you should never let a good crisis go to waste. He said that in November 2008, as the bottom was falling out of modern capitalism. 5 years on, Tony Blair, writing 2 weeks ago in the New Statesman, remarked on the paradox that although the financial crisis was widely been caused by under-regulated markets, it hadn't actually produced a decisive shift to the left. And indeed, in many ways, the existing order seemed more entrenched now than it did in 2008 when the crisis really took off. So how does change in economic policy frameworks come about? What makes for an economic policy paradigm change? The most famous explanation of this is Hall's 1993 article in Comparative Politics on Social Learning, where he conceptualised 3 orders of change. Changing the instrument settings, changing and the introduction of new instruments, which he saw as taking place within a set of policy goals that structured policy solutions, indeed really like a Gestalt, which structured the very way that you saw the world, saw the problems that you were, and therefore structured solutions. But you recognise that sometimes the goals of policy itself would change. So this looks a bit more like a kind of Kuhnian normal science. This is a paradigm shift. And he explains that, he used that model to examine an instance of paradigm change, the collapse of the Keynesian, the post-war Keynesian settlement in Britain. He talks about initial paradigm stability, the emergence of anomalies with the paradigm, that actually policymakers might try to solve with first and second order changes, but those changes were doomed to fail because they were being made within the context of the existing paradigm. The result of that, a breakdown in the authority of elites, the breaking open of the policy process as new ideas begin to emerge in wider society, particularly in academia, and politicians reach out for these ideas and politicise them, but work them into their programmes to get a political battle of ideas, and resolved with the election of Margaret Thatcher in 1979. I love Hall's model, it's really elegant. The problem is that it's not actually an explanation for what happened, which is rather more complicated. In particular, what we find is that actually the government, the Labour government, found itself able to borrow some of these competing ideas coming out from the new right, monetarist ideas, and also the ideas that the state should not increase as a proportion of GDP indefinitely, and was able to actually implement aspects of that competing programme, and actually to stabilise the model. So the model evolved. By 78, Labour had managed to restart growth, unemployment was higher, inflation was lower, balance of payments was much improved, government spending was falling as a proportion of the economy. And in fact, it was also ahead in the opinion polls in the autumn of 1978. Unfortunately, it was then blown out of the water by the winter of discontent. An election took place. But even that is not the end of the story, because the monetarism that was implemented in 1979 was a long way from what we came to call the neoliberal model. So we really have to project ourselves forward, perhaps to Nigel Lawson becoming Chancellor in '84, and his move towards targeting the Deutschmark as a way of restraining inflation. But probably really to the collapse of Britain's ignominious exit from the EURL in 1997. 1992, and the installation by the major government of inflation targeting. So from start to finish, actually, this process takes as long as 20 years. And it's much more contingent than Horn thinks it is. The same is actually true in the other instance of policy paradigm change that we've been going through, which is the Keynesian revolution always said to have taken place in the 30s. The reality is that actually the Treasury was very good at borrowing Keynesian ideas. It's certainly true that the failure, the 1929 crash, discredited the Treasury. You get this marketplace for ideas. Keynes fills that market brilliantly and became Keynesian's disciples. They sell their ideas actively in this marketplace. And, but actually the Treasury is able to take on important aspects of Keynesian policy prescriptions like deficit financing in order to manage demand, regional policy. There's a series of things that they do which actually are not without success, and they do manage, in fact, to kind of, through taking on some of these ideas, implementing new policy instruments, they manage some kind of stability by the end of the 30s. It's actually the coming of war which is the key moment, because in order to run a total war economy, the government turns to Keynes and the people around Keynes for ideas about how to manage a total war economy. And it's at that point, it's not until 1941 at the earliest that we can say that Keynesian ideas enter into the policy process, so 12 years after the 1929 crash. And really probably not until 1947 that they're actually used in a peacetime context, 18 years after the 1929 crash. The current crisis was a massive shock to the system. We've forgotten how massive it was. The system modern capitalist system nearly collapsed. It was really that close, I think. What's interesting, though, is the anomalies emerged with remarkable rapidity. It's 16 months from the first reports of problems in the US subprime market to the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers in September 2008. Quite plainly, this is a massive problem of authority, but the response actually is inordinately quick. What happens is that the language of policy changes almost overnight, and we get Keynesian re-entering the policy vocabulary. In other words, we get third-order learning by the Treasury. Now, this is much wider than the UK, of course, and Gordon Brown go from hero to zero, as one author said in the book I read a couple of weeks ago, saves the world. But certainly coordinates a massive fiscal intervention across the G20 economies. And actually, ironically, the neoliberal model is saved by Keynesianism. And is probably more entrenched now than it was in 2008. So in a sense that resolves Blair's paradox. But we're only 5 years in. In other words, we don't know how things are going to play out. We don't know that they've actually managed to return this model to stability, and there are good reasons for thinking that they haven't. In which case, we don't know where we're going to end up. There's still, in other words, we look back at the previous instances of paradigm change, there is still a lot to play for. So I'd just like to pull out a few things from this. The first is that Hall's model is very elegant, but it's not a complete description of paradigm change in economic policy. In particular, we've identified that paradigm change is much more contingent and much more drawn out than Hall thinks it is. The other thing is that new ideas can enter a policy vacuum created by a major shock to the system. But those new ideas have to be actively sold to politicians. They have to be translated into language that politicians can understand. And we see this both in the 30s and the 70s. And politicians have to understand why it is in their political interest to take on those ideas. A paradigm may be stabilised by borrowing from alternative idea sets. In other words, the paradigm can evolve, and evolve quite a long way from where it started out, without the broad goals of policy changing. But if that strategy fails, and that may come with a further major shock, then actually we do have the potential for paradigm revolution. And see, now to be in a state where we've got an evolved paradigm, we've got stability, albeit at suboptimal output. Where we go from here is an appropriate question. And there I shall end. Thanks very much.